The Abyssinian Baptist Church stood at 132 West 138th Street in Harlem, between Malcolm X Boulevard and Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. Boulevard. The church building had been constructed in 1923 in Gothic and Tudor Revival architectural styles, with limestone facades and a sanctuary that could accommodate more than 2,000 people. By the spring of 1965, Abyssinian Baptist had become one of the most prominent black churches in America, led by Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., who served simultaneously as pastor and as the most powerful African-American politician in the United States. On the morning of April 14, 1965, at approximately 9:30, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson arrived at the church offices located in the building adjacent to the main sanctuary. Johnson was 59 years old, dressed in a dark gray suit, white shirt, and burgundy tie. He had been released from Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary approximately 2 years earlier, in June 1963, after serving 11 years of a 15-year sentence for drug conspiracy. Since his release, Johnson had been working to reassert control over Harlem's illegal gambling operations while also involving himself in community affairs and civil rights activities. Johnson met with Reverend David Licorice, who served as assistant pastor at Abyssinian Baptist and who handled much of the church's administrative work, including arrangements for funerals and memorial services. Johnson stated that he wished to discuss arrangements for an upcoming funeral service. Reverend Licorice asked whose funeral Johnson was inquiring about. Johnson explained that he was asking about arrangements for Thomas McKinney, a 53-year-old resident of Harlem who had died 3 days earlier on April 11th. Reverend Licorice knew about McKinney's death. McKinney had been a longtime member of Abyssinian Baptist, attending services regularly for more than 20 years. He had worked as a maintenance supervisor at a commercial building in Midtown Manhattan, earning modest wages that had supported his wife and 3 children. McKinney had suffered a heart attack while at work and had died before reaching the hospital. His death had left his family in difficult circumstances because McKinney had been the family's sole income source and because the family had no savings to cover funeral expenses. Reverend Licorice explained to Johnson that McKinney's widow, Dorothy McKinney, had met with him the previous day to discuss funeral arrangements. She wanted to have a proper service at Abyssinian Baptist, where her husband had been a faithful member, but she lacked funds to pay for the service or for burial. The church could provide the sanctuary at no charge, but the funeral home costs, the casket, the burial plot, and associated expenses would total approximately $2,000. Mrs. McKinney had told Reverend Licorice that she would need to arrange a very simple service with the least expensive options and that she would need to arrange payment over time if possible. Johnson listened to this information and then stated that he would pay for Thomas McKinney's funeral in full. He would cover all costs, including the funeral home services, a quality casket, the burial plot at Woodlawn Cemetery, flowers, programs, and any other expenses associated with giving McKinney a dignified funeral service. Johnson stated that Mrs. McKinney should have the funeral she wanted for her husband without worrying about cost, and that the church should arrange everything as if money were not a constraint. Reverend Licorice was not surprised by Johnson's offer. Johnson was known throughout Harlem for paying funeral expenses for community members who could not afford them. This was one of several ways Johnson provided financial assistance to Harlem residents, along with helping families pay rent when they faced eviction, providing money for medical expenses, supporting local businesses, and making donations to churches and civil rights organizations. Reverend Licorice thanked Johnson for his generosity and said he would inform Mrs. McKinney of the arrangement. Johnson stated that he wanted the arrangement handled in a specific way. He did not want Mrs. McKinney told that Johnson was paying for the funeral. Instead, Reverend Licorice should tell her that an anonymous benefactor had provided funds to cover all funeral expenses. Johnson emphasized this point. Mrs. McKinney should not know that the money came from him, and no one should inform her of this fact. Johnson would arrange for payment to be delivered to the funeral home and to the cemetery directly, and all transactions should be handled discreetly without Johnson's name attached. Reverend Licorice found this request somewhat unusual. In his experience, people who made substantial charitable donations generally wanted recognition for their generosity, or at minimum did not object to recipients knowing who had helped them. Johnson's insistence on complete anonymity seemed to suggest different motivations. Reverend Licorice agreed to handle the arrangement as Johnson specified. Johnson then asked about the planned date for the funeral service. Reverend Licorice said that pending resolution of the financial issues, the service would likely be scheduled for Saturday, April 17th, 3 days from now, at 2 in the afternoon. Johnson stated that he would ensure all payments were made by Friday afternoon so that arrangements could proceed without delay. Johnson left the church offices and walked south on Malcolm X Boulevard toward 135th Street. His outward appearance remained calm and unremarkable. He walked at a measured pace, acknowledged people he passed with brief nods, and gave no indication that the conversation he had just concluded represented anything other than a routine charitable act. But Johnson's mind worked systematically through calculations about what he had set in motion and what effects would follow. Johnson had not known Thomas McKinney personally. He was aware of McKinney in the general way that someone who lived in a neighborhood for decades might be aware of other longtime residents. He had seen McKinney at church events and around the neighborhood, knew that McKinney worked steadily and supported his family, knew that McKinney was respected as a decent and hard-working man. But Johnson and McKinney had not been friends, had not socialized, and had no particular connection beyond living in the same community. Johnson's decision to pay for McKinney's funeral was not motivated by personal affection or by obligation to a friend or associate. The decision was strategic, based on Johnson's understanding of several overlapping circumstances that had developed over the previous weeks, and that required a response more sophisticated than direct confrontation. The first circumstance involved the Genovese crime family's increasing pressure on Johnson's operations in Harlem. Johnson had maintained a working arrangement with the Italian mob families since 1935, paying 15% of his gambling profits in exchange for the family's agreement not to interfere with his control of Harlem's numbers rackets. This arrangement had functioned reasonably well for 3 decades, but in the months since Johnson's release from Alcatraz, the Genovese family had been testing whether Johnson still commanded sufficient power to maintain his independence. Representatives of the Genovese family had approached several of Johnson's numbers runners and collectors with proposals to work directly for the family at higher commissions. These approaches had not been aggressive or threatening. They were presented as opportunities, suggestions that runners might earn more money by shifting their loyalty from Johnson to the family. Most runners had declined these approaches, but the mere fact that the approaches were being made signaled that the Genovese family was assessing whether Johnson's organization remained cohesive and loyal after his years in prison. The second circumstance involved increasing police pressure on gambling operations in Harlem, and the New York Police Department had initiated a new enforcement campaign focused on illegal gambling, with particular attention to Harlem. Multiple numbers operators had been arrested in recent weeks, collection points had been raided, and several runners had been charged with gambling-related offenses. The campaign appeared to be politically motivated. A new police commissioner was seeking to demonstrate effectiveness in fighting organized crime, and Harlem's visible numbers operations provided convenient targets. The third circumstance involved growing frustration within Harlem's community about the relationship between gambling, poverty, and opportunity. As civil rights activists had begun emphasizing that illegal gambling operations extracted money from poor black communities and channeled those resources to criminal organizations rather than to community development. Some ministers and community leaders had started calling for residents to stop playing the numbers and to redirect that money toward education, business development, and political organizing. Johnson recognized that these three circumstances were interconnected and that they created vulnerability for his position in Harlem. If the Genovese family concluded that Johnson's organization was weak and that his community support was eroding, they might attempt to impose direct control over Harlem's operations. If police enforcement continued to disrupt gambling activities, Johnson's revenue would decline and his ability to maintain his organization would diminish. If community sentiment turned decisively against gambling operations, Johnson would lose the protective buffer that Harlem residents' tolerance and support had provided for decades. Johnson understood that responding to these challenges through traditional methods, increasing enforcement against runners who considered defecting, retaliating against police informants, or attempting to intimidate civil rights activists, would be counterproductive. Such responses would confirm perceptions that Johnson was a criminal figure whose power derived from fear rather than from community relationships. They would provide justification for increased police pressure and would validate arguments that gambling operations harmed rather than benefited Harlem. What Johnson needed was a demonstration that his power in Harlem derived not from criminal capacity, but from genuine relationships with community residents, from integration into the neighborhood's social fabric, and from recognition as someone who contributed positively to Harlem's collective life, even while operating illegal businesses. He needed to show multiple audiences simultaneously that his position was fundamentally different from that of outside criminal organizations that extracted resources without giving back, and that any attempt to marginalize him or to take over his operations would face resistance not just from his own organization, but from the broader community. Paying for Thomas McKinney's funeral served these strategic purposes. McKinney represented exactly the kind of person whose support Johnson needed. A working man with no connection to criminal activity, a longtime church member with standing in the community, someone whose family faced genuine hardship and who deserved assistance. By paying for McKinney's funeral anonymously, Johnson would demonstrate generosity that was not performative or self-serving, but that was motivated by concern for community members, regardless of whether Johnson received credit. More importantly, Johnson understood that while the payment would be anonymous officially, the reality of how information circulated in Harlem meant that people would learn who had actually provided the money. Reverend Licorice would be discreet, but other church members who saw Johnson at the church offices would wonder why he had been there. A funeral home staff would note who arranged payment. Cemetery workers would hear about the unusual arrangement. Within days, multiple people would know or suspect that Johnson had paid for McKinney's funeral, and that knowledge would spread through Harlem's social networks naturally, without Johnson needing to claim credit directly. This indirect revelation was more powerful than direct publicity would have been. If Johnson openly announced that he was paying for the funeral, it would appear calculated and self-promoting. If people discovered his role through their own networks and conversations, it would seem like authentic generosity that Johnson had tried to conceal, which made the act appear more genuine and which made Johnson appear more admirable for not seeking recognition. Johnson spent the remainder of Wednesday and all day Thursday arranging the practical details. He met with Frank Murphy, the owner of Murphy Brothers Funeral Home on West 145th Street, and arranged for all funeral expenses to be paid in cash by Friday afternoon. He contacted the administration office at Woodlawn Cemetery and arranged for purchase of a burial plot. He spoke with a florist and ordered arrangements for the service. All of these transactions were conducted discreetly, with Johnson presenting himself simply as someone handling arrangements for the McKinney family without explaining his own relationship to the family. By Friday morning, April 16th, information about Johnson's role had begun circulating in Harlem. Multiple people had seen Johnson at the funeral home, at the cemetery office, and meeting with vendors. People had noted his presence at Abyssinian Baptist earlier in the week. Conversations had occurred in barbershops, in restaurants, at church meetings, and in homes throughout the neighborhood. The consensus that emerged was that Bumpy Johnson had paid for Thomas McKinney's funeral expenses, even though McKinney had not been one of Johnson's associates, and even though Johnson had arranged the payment anonymously. The funeral service for Thomas McKinney took place on Saturday, April 17, 1965, at Abyssinian Baptist Church. Approximately 400 people attended: family members, friends, co-workers, fellow church members, and community residents who had known McKinney or who came to support his widow and children. The service followed traditional Baptist funeral protocols with hymns, eulogies, prayers, and remembrances of McKinney's life and character. Reverend Licorice presided over the service and spoke about McKinney as a faithful member of the church community and as a devoted family man who had worked hard to provide for his loved ones. Johnson attended the funeral service, arriving shortly before it began and taking a seat near the back of the sanctuary. He was dressed in a dark suit and sat quietly throughout the service, standing for hymns and bowing his head during prayers, but otherwise remaining still and unobtrusive. After the service concluded, he joined the line of people offering condolences to Mrs. McKinney and her children. When he reached the family, Johnson shook Mrs. McKinney's hand, expressed sympathy for her loss, stated that her husband had been a good man, and moved on without any extended conversation. And Mrs. McKinney did not know at that moment that Johnson had paid for the funeral. She knew only that an anonymous benefactor had provided the funds that allowed her to give her husband a proper service and burial. She was grateful for this assistance, but had no way of knowing who had provided it. However, several people standing near Mrs. McKinney during the receiving line knew or suspected Johnson's role, and in the days following the funeral, they would share this information with her. The effects of Johnson's action began manifesting over the following weeks through multiple channels that reached different audiences with different messages. Within Harlem's community, the story of Johnson paying for McKinney's funeral reinforced existing perceptions that Johnson was someone who genuinely cared about Harlem residents and who used his wealth to help people in need. The fact that Johnson had paid anonymously made the action seem more authentic and more admirable than if he had sought publicity for his generosity. Conversations in churches, community meetings, and social gatherings referenced the funeral payment as evidence that Johnson understood his responsibilities to the neighborhood and that his relationship with Harlem was fundamentally different from the relationship that outside criminal organizations had with communities they exploited. This community perception mattered because it created a protective barrier around Johnson's operations. Residents who knew that Johnson helped families in need were less likely to cooperate with police investigations of gambling activities. Ministers who respected Johnson's generosity were less likely to condemn gambling operations in their sermons. Community leaders who appreciated Johnson's financial support for civil rights organizations were less likely to call for aggressive enforcement against numbers operations. The funeral payment reinforced the social license that allowed Johnson to operate with relative community tolerance despite being involved in illegal activities. For numbers runners and collectors in Johnson's organization, the funeral payment sent a message about leadership and about the kind of organization they worked for. Runners who had been approached by Genevieve's family representatives with offers of higher commissions now had reason to consider what kind of employer they preferred. An outside mob family that would extract maximum profit from Harlem with no concern for community welfare, or a local operator who understood obligations to the neighborhood and who demonstrated that understanding through actions like paying for community members' funerals. Several runners who had been considering the Genovese family's offers decided to remain with Johnson's organization after hearing about the funeral payment. The payment illustrated a fundamental difference in values and in approach to business. Johnson's organization was embedded in Harlem and accountable to Harlem's community in ways that outside operators would never be. And this accountability created expectations and constraints, but it also created loyalty and stability that pure financial incentives could not match. For the Genovese crime family, the funeral payment and the community response it generated provided information about the obstacles they would face if they attempted to take direct control of Harlem's operations. Family leadership understood that establishing operations in Harlem would require more than simply offering better financial terms to runners or threatening violence against Johnson's organization. They would need to overcome community support for Johnson that was rooted in decades of relationship building and that was reinforced constantly through actions like the funeral payment. Vincent Gigante, who effectively controlled the Genovese family's operations while officially presenting himself as mentally ill to avoid prosecution, received reports from family associates about the funeral payment and about community reactions to it. Gigante understood that attempting to push Johnson aside would create complications the family preferred to avoid. It would generate community resistance, would attract unwanted law enforcement attention, and would require ongoing management of operations in a neighborhood where the family had no relationships and no understanding of local dynamics. The conclusion Gigante reached was that the existing arrangement with Johnson remained more beneficial than alternative approaches. Johnson paid 15% of gambling profits to the family, which provided substantial income without requiring the family to manage operations or to navigate Harlem's social complexities. Attempting to increase the family's share or to impose direct control would generate conflict that might reduce overall revenue and that might create problems with law enforcement and with Harlem's community leaders, some of whom had political power that could complicate the family's interests. By early May 1965, approximately 3 weeks after McKinney's funeral, the Genovese family stopped approaching Johnson's runners with recruitment offers. Family representatives conveyed to Johnson through intermediaries that the family respected the current arrangement and had no interest in disrupting operations that functioned successfully. This represented a decision by the family to accept Johnson's continued independence and to maintain the long-standing agreement rather than testing whether they could extract more favorable terms. For the New York Police Department, the funeral payment complicated the political narrative around gambling enforcement in Harlem. The police commissioner's campaign against illegal gambling had been premised partly on the argument that gambling operations were purely criminal enterprises that exploited poor communities without providing any benefit. The campaign had sought to portray operators like Johnson as criminals who should be arrested and prosecuted without community sympathy or support. The funeral payment and the positive community response to it undermined this simple narrative. It demonstrated that at least some gambling operators had complex relationships with their communities that included genuine mutual obligations and authentic care for residents' welfare. This complexity made it harder to justify aggressive enforcement that ignored community perspectives about gambling's role in Harlem's economy and social structure. Several officers who worked in Harlem had attended McKinney's funeral, not because they were investigating Johnson, but because they knew McKinney through community interactions and because attending funerals of community members was part of effective police work in any neighborhood. These officers saw the quality of the funeral service, heard conversations about Johnson's role in funding it, and observed community respect for both McKinney and for Johnson's generosity. All they understood that aggressive enforcement targeting Johnson specifically would face community resistance and would damage police relationships with Harlem residents who viewed Johnson as a complex figure rather than simply as a criminal. Reports from officers working in Harlem influenced decisions by police leadership about how to allocate enforcement resources. While gambling operations continued to face some enforcement pressure, the aggressive campaign that had characterized the previous months diminished in intensity. Police leadership concluded that enforcement should focus on operators who lacked community support and who operated purely for profit extraction rather than targeting figures like Johnson who had complicated relationships with their neighborhoods. For civil rights activists and community leaders who had been criticizing gambling operations as harmful to Harlem, the funeral payment created nuance in a debate that some had tried to present in absolute terms. Activists who argued that gambling operations should be eliminated entirely had to contend with the reality that at least some operators contributed positively to community welfare in ways that went beyond their criminal enterprises. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., who as pastor of Abyssinian Baptist knew about Johnson's role in funding McKinney's funeral, found himself navigating this complexity. Powell had spoken publicly about problems caused by illegal gambling, including resources flowing out of Harlem and into criminal organizations. But Powell also understood that Johnson's support had been valuable for civil rights activities and for community programs, and that Johnson's relationship with Harlem was fundamentally different from relationships that outside mob families had with communities they controlled. Powell's position, which influenced other community leaders, was that gambling operations represented a complicated reality that required sophisticated analysis rather than simple condemnation. Ideally, resources currently directed to illegal gambling should be redirected toward community development and toward legitimate economic activities. But in the actual circumstances of Harlem in 1965, with limited economic opportunities and with discrimination restricting access to legitimate businesses, gambling operations provided employment and generated capital that sometimes circulated back into the community through people like Johnson who understood their obligations to the neighborhood. This nuanced position meant that community leaders did not join police campaigns for aggressive enforcement against Johnson's operations. They continued to articulate concerns about gambling's negative effects, but they did not call for Johnson to be prosecuted or for his operations to be destroyed. This relative tolerance preserved Johnson's ability to operate while maintaining his community relationships. The most significant effect of Johnson's action operated at a level that was harder to measure, but that was perhaps most important for his long-term position. And the funeral payment reinforced a particular understanding of what kind of power Johnson exercised and where that power came from. In a period when some people questioned whether Johnson could maintain his position after years in prison, and when various parties were testing whether his power had diminished, the funeral payment demonstrated that Johnson's power derived from community relationships rather than from criminal capacity alone. Criminal capacity, the ability to use violence or threats to enforce compliance, was always temporary and always vulnerable to challenge by parties with greater resources or greater willingness to be violent. Community relationships, by contrast, created more durable power because they were rooted in mutual obligations, shared values, and authentic care that could not be easily displaced by outside competitors. By demonstrating that his power derived substantially from community relationships, Johnson signaled that attempts to challenge his position would face obstacles beyond simply defeating him in criminal competition. This understanding influenced how multiple parties approached their relationships with Johnson throughout the remainder of the 1960s. The Genovese family maintained the long-standing arrangement rather than seeking to change it. Police directed enforcement resources elsewhere rather than targeting Johnson specifically. Community leaders maintained working relationships with Johnson while advocating for broader social changes. Runners and collectors remained loyal to his organization rather than defecting to competitors. All of these parties had different motivations and different interests, but all concluded that maintaining stable relationships with Johnson served their purposes better than attempting to marginalize him or to challenge his position. Thomas McKinney's widow, Dorothy, learned within a week after the funeral that Bumpy Johnson had paid for all the expenses. Several church members shared this information with her, explaining that Johnson had specifically requested anonymity, but that people in the community knew what he had done. Mrs. McKinney was moved by this generosity and grateful that her husband had received a dignified funeral that honored his life and his service to his family and community. In the years following McKinney's funeral, Mrs. McKinney occasionally encountered Johnson at church events or around the neighborhood. She always thanked him for his kindness and told him that his generosity had meant a great deal to her family during a very difficult time. Johnson consistently responded that he had been honored to help and that Thomas McKinney had been a good man who deserved respect. These brief interactions illustrated the genuine human dimension of Johnson's action. Beyond the strategic calculations, there had been real assistance provided to a real family that faced real hardship. The funeral payment became part of Harlem's collective memory as one example among many of how Bumpy Johnson understood his relationship with the community. People told the story when explaining why Johnson was a complicated figure who could not be understood simply as a criminal. Parents told the story to children when teaching about generosity and about obligations to help others. Ministers referenced the story in sermons about bearing one another's burdens. Community leaders discussed the story when debating complex questions about crime, poverty, and community mutual aid in circumstances where formal institutions provided inadequate support. The story also became part of how people understood power itself, not as something that came from domination or from inspiring fear, but as something that came from relationships, from being integrated into community life, from demonstrating authentic concern for others' welfare, and from building trust through consistent actions over time. This understanding of power was sophisticated, and it was accurate. Johnson's position in Harlem had always depended more on community relationships than on criminal capacity, though both dimensions mattered. The funeral payment exemplified the community dimension and reminded all parties about where Johnson's real strength resided. For Johnson himself, the funeral payment represented a strategic investment that paid returns beyond what any single expenditure on enforcement or on traditional criminal capacity could have generated. The $2,000 spent on McKinney's funeral would have covered perhaps 2 weeks of protection payments to police officers, or would have funded a small enforcement action against competitors. Instead, those $2,000 purchased reinforcement of community relationships that protected Johnson's operations more effectively than direct enforcement could have, that complicated enforcement efforts against him, that deterred competitors from challenging his position, and that maintained his standing as someone whose power derived from community integration rather than from fear alone. The investment also provided insurance against future challenges in ways that were difficult to quantify, but that were nonetheless real. If circumstances changed and Johnson faced serious threats to his position, his community relationships would be valuable assets that could be mobilized for support. If law enforcement launched major investigations, community members' reluctance to cooperate would create obstacles to prosecution. If competing organizations attempted to establish operations in Harlem, community resistance would make their efforts more difficult and costly. All of these protective benefits flowed from the same source: Johnson's demonstrated commitment to community welfare, exemplified by actions like paying for Thomas McKinney's funeral. Johnson continued his pattern of community assistance throughout the remaining years of his life. He paid for other funerals when families faced need. He provided Thanksgiving turkeys and Christmas gifts to families. He helped people facing eviction by providing rent money. He supported civil rights organizations financially. He maintained relationships with churches and with community institutions. Each of these actions served both genuine charitable purposes and strategic purposes. They helped people who needed assistance, and they reinforced the community relationships that protected Johnson's position and that defined his power. When Johnson died on July 7th, 1968, approximately 3 years after paying for Thomas McKinney's funeral, thousands of people attended his own funeral at St. Martin's Episcopal Church in Manhattan. The massive turnout reflected Johnson's complex legacy in Harlem. He had been a criminal, certainly, but he had also been a community figure who understood his obligations to the neighborhood and who had used his wealth and influence to help residents in need. People who attended Johnson's funeral understood that they were mourning someone whose life defied simple categorization and whose relationship with Harlem had been characterized by both criminal activity and genuine community care. Dorothy McKinney attended Johnson's funeral. She brought her adult children, who remembered their father's funeral 3 years earlier, and who understood that Johnson's generosity had allowed their family to honor their father with dignity during a painful time. Mrs. McKinney told her children that whatever else might be said about Bumpy Johnson, he had been kind to their family when kindness mattered most, and that kindness deserved to be remembered and acknowledged. The legacy of Johnson's approach to power built on community relationships rather than on fear alone, influenced thinking about leadership and about the relationship between individuals with resources and the communities in which they operated. The lesson was not that criminal activity was acceptable if accompanied by charitable acts. The lesson was rather that power derived from authentic relationships, from demonstrated care for others' welfare, from integration into community life, and from building trust through consistent actions over time, was more durable and more effective than power derived from domination or from capacity for violence. This lesson applied far beyond criminal enterprises. Political leaders, business figures, community organizers, and institutions of all kinds derived their power ultimately from relationships with the people they served or represented. Leaders who understood their power as coming from those relationships, who invested in maintaining those relationships, and who demonstrated through their actions that they cared about community welfare, were more successful and more secure in their positions than leaders who relied on formal authority or on capacity to impose consequences. And the story of Johnson paying for Thomas McKinney's funeral became a reference point for understanding these principles. It illustrated how a relatively modest expenditure on an action that appeared to be simply charitable actually represented a sophisticated strategic investment in community relationships. It showed how actions that appeared to benefit others primarily actually benefited the actor by reinforcing the social bonds and mutual obligations that protected his position. It demonstrated how power worked in complex social environments where multiple parties had competing interests, but where all parties recognized certain shared values and where actions that honored those shared values created legitimacy that could not be achieved through fear or through formal authority alone. For Harlem, and the story represented something specific about the neighborhood's experience during a period when outside forces constantly threatened to exploit or marginalize the community. Johnson's position as a local operator who maintained some independence from outside mob families, who kept substantial resources circulating within Harlem rather than extracting everything for outside interests, and who understood his obligations to the community, represented a form of resistance to complete external control. This resistance was imperfect, and it operated within criminal structures that caused real harm. But within those constraints, Johnson's maintenance of local control and his demonstrated care for community welfare represented something valuable that Harlem residents recognized and appreciated, even as they acknowledged the problems inherent in gambling operations. The funeral payment became emblematic of this complicated reality, not a simple story of good versus evil, but a story about how people navigated difficult circumstances with limited options, about how power operated through relationships rather than through domination, about how strategic calculations could align with genuine human concern, and about how actions that appeared simple on their surface could carry multiple meanings and could serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Years after both Johnson and McKinney had died, people in Harlem still told the story of the funeral payment. They told it to explain why Johnson had been a complicated figure whose legacy defied simple judgment. They told it to illustrate principles about power, community, obligation, and leadership that remained relevant regardless of the specific historical circumstances. They told it because it captured something true about how relationships worked in communities, about what created loyalty and trust, about what made some leaders effective while others failed, and about how sophisticated understanding of social dynamics could make a single act of apparent generosity into a strategic move that shaped power relationships for years to come. The $2,000 Johnson spent on Thomas McKinney's funeral in April 1965 bought more than a casket and a burial plot. It bought reinforcement of community relationships that protected Johnson's operations, that deterred competitors, that complicated enforcement efforts, and that maintained his position as a figure whose power derived from community integration rather than from criminal capacity alone. It bought insurance against future challenges. It bought legitimacy that could not be purchased through any amount of spending on traditional criminal capacity. Most importantly, it bought time, 3 more years during which Johnson could operate with relative security, during which he could continue his complicated role in Harlem's life, and during which he could demonstrate again and again through his actions that his relationship with the community was characterized by mutual obligations and authentic care rather than by pure exploitation. When the city understood the message that Johnson's funeral payment sent, what the city understood was not a simple message about generosity or about public relations. What the city understood was a sophisticated message about power, that Johnson's position in Harlem was protected not by fear, but by community relationships, that challenging his position would face obstacles beyond simple criminal competition, that his integration into Harlem's social fabric made him fundamentally different from outside operators who sought only to extract resources, and that his understanding of his obligations to the community created bonds that served both charitable and strategic purposes. This understanding influenced how multiple parties, mob families, police, community leaders, operators, or residents approached their relationships with Johnson for the remainder of his life. The funeral payment had achieved exactly what Johnson intended. It had reinforced the foundations of his power at a moment when those foundations were being tested, and it had done so through an action that appeared to be simply an act of human kindness to a family in need.